Hello friends and night owls. Tonight we have a special series I want to bring you. A while back when the channel finally eclipsed 10,000 subs, I wanted to do something to show you all my gratitude, so I thought I would try to give back by doing a community iceberg with all of the entries coming from you guys. I made a post about it, asking for suggestions, and you guys delivered. The following ones are some of my favorites. However, if I didn't cover one of the ones you suggested, don't get mad, cause I plan to do a follow-up on this series again in the future. In addition, when the channel hit 10,000 subs, I decided to create a Patreon since some of you prefer that. Membership allows you early access to all of the channel videos, plus exclusive videos and playlists of mysteries I cover just for the members. With all of that being said, thanks again for your support. But now, let's flip that pillow over to the cool side, get into the resting position, because we are going to look at some mysteries. September 11th, 2001. A defining moment not only in American history, but world history as well. And in events of that magnitude, it's not uncommon for grand conspiracies to pop up around it, or for some questions to never get answered. And one of those mysteries still endures to this day, and is that of Sneha Philip. Sneha was a 31-year-old woman from India who moved to upstate New York when she was a child. She would pursue a career in medicine upon graduating and would become a doctor. During her time in school, she met a man named Robert Lieberman, whom she would get involved with, and the two would eventually move to New York City together and marry in May of 2000. But now, we fast forward to September 10th, 2000, a day when Sneha was off from work. According to her husband Robert, she had planned to spend the day cleaning up the apartment because in 2 nights, her cousin was coming by to have dinner. That evening, she got online to chat with her mother for 2 hours, where she mentioned she planned to go to Windows of the World restaurant on top of the North Tower of the World Trade Center. At around 4 p.m., she logged out of the chat and went to drop off some clothes at the dry cleaner. She then stopped at a department store to buy lingerie, a dress, pantyhose, and bed linens. She then bought 3 pairs of shoes before leaving, and the security camera at the store would record her last official sighting, because later around midnight, Robert would come home and notice she was not there. He believed she had most likely decided to stay out late, or possibly all night, as apparently she had been doing this for a while. He would make a note to himself to let her know the next time she planned doing this again to at least call him and let him know. He then went to bed since he had to get up early for work. The next morning, he would go in at 6:30 a.m. and notice she had still not returned. He was confused, but assumed she would be home soon. He would leave to work, and we all know what happens later this day, as the 9/11 attacks would occur. Robert would then go back home, where he was able to use his medical credentials to get through the security perimeter and into his apartment. Since the window had been left open, dust was all over the floor, and in that dust was only the tracks from their kittens, no human footprints. Now Robert was really concerned for Sneha. She typically didn't stay gone this long, and now on top of that was a devastating terrorist attack. And of course, this was the worst time ever in New York to have to file a missing persons report, but that's all her family could do, as well as posting flyers all over the city. But since her disappearance was not thought to be connected to the attacks, the media didn't cover it. Now, understandably, the police had their hands full, so Robert, not wanting to waste any more time, began his own investigation. And he wasn't just some armchair sleuth either. He was a former FBI agent, but he did hire a private investigator to help, a man named Ken Gallant, who would eventually find 2 big clues. First, he discovered a phone call from Robert's home phone had been placed to his cell phone at 4 a.m. the night all of this happened. Now Robert didn't remember this, but stated he thought he had called it to check his voicemail. But the more interesting clue was he would get access to some of the video from the security cameras in the lobby of the apartment. These were time-stamped just 3 minutes before the first plane crashed into the tower. This also fit the time frame the Sneha typically came back home after her nights out. The footage was not conclusive, but it showed a woman entering the building, waiting near the elevator, and leaving after a few minutes. The quality was poor, and the woman was only visible in silhouette, but her hair and dress did look the way Sneha appeared the evening before, as well as her family all believed the mannerisms were the same. Strangely, she did not have any bags from shopping, and Robert said he could not be for sure if it was her or not, although the NYPD did later state they believed it was her. The private eye, Ken, then began to speculate, was it possible she had used the attacks as a way to get out and start a new life? He began to follow this hunch, but quickly gave it up when he could find no evidence to support it. Plus, her glasses, passport, driver's license, and credit cards were all left behind, except for the one she had used the night before to shop with. Ken would then conclude, along with Robert, that after witnessing the attack, she went to the site to render aid and either died in the second attack or the collapse of the first tower. But this is where the case gets even stranger. When things began to settle down in New York, which obviously took quite a while, the NYPD would begin their own investigation and they disagreed with Robert and the private eye. In fact, their investigation revealed something else completely. For one, it seemed like Sneha's life was falling apart because the medical center where she had worked had declined to renew her contract, citing her repeated tardiness as well as she had an alcohol problem. So basically, they fired her. But it only got worse from there. Shortly after she was let go, she went to a bar with some other employees, and this led to her actually being arrested. Because it was that night, while she was out with former co-workers, she would go tell police that an intern had groped her. The prosecutor opened an investigation and soon found that Sneha had made the whole thing up, and she was then charged with falsely reporting an incident. Why she did this, I could not find, but the prosecutor offered to drop the charge if she would just take back the complaint, but she refused and spent the night in jail. Now remember how I mentioned she was spending all those nights away? Well, where she was going was soon uncovered by the police. Sneha had apparently began going out to lesbian bars, and according to the police, would sometimes leave with women she met there and would spend the night with them. And these bars she was going to, they were not known for nice people. It was some of the seedier venues in town. It was then that the police also found out she had apparently slept with her brother's girlfriend, which her brother disputed. She had also gotten another internship but had the same problems again and began missing meetings with her substance abuse counselor, which brings us back to September 10th. That morning, Sneha had been formally arraigned on the criminal charge of falsely reporting an incident and pled not guilty. But it's here that witnesses would report that as her and Robert left the courthouse, they got into a loud argument about her problems and spending nights out, which ended up with her walking off and going home to get ready for work. It's because of all that the NYPD theorized that during the 9/11 attacks, she had already gone somewhere else or was possibly dead. This would be taken further when the medical examiner removed her from the list of 9/11 victims. Of course, Robert and her family denied all of this. First they said she did not get fired for alcoholism, but instead was fired because she was a whistleblower that had reported racial and sexual discrimination. And the reason that she had went to lesbian bars was because she did not want to be groped like she had been by the co-worker, so she went there, stating that it was safer. He also claimed that although she was staying all night with these women, there was no sexual relations. Instead, they were just listening to music or sleeping. And her brother would state that the claim that she was caught with his girlfriend was a complete lie made up by the police. Furthermore, Robert stated her drinking issue was temporary and due to depression from losing her job. All in all, the family stated the NYPD's actions were in an effort to make up for their not looking into the case much sooner. And to the family's credit, not all of the NYPD detectives agreed. In fact, the author of the official NYPD report on the matter would later testify that she most likely died in the attacks. This case is a very weird one, and for many years, Sneha's name remained removed from the official list of victims, citing there was not enough evidence to establish she was ever at the World Trade Center during the attacks. Although, the courts did go back and reverse this, and once again, ruled she was a victim of the attacks. And that basically leaves us with one of two theories. She either died as a result of the attacks, or didn't. And if she didn't, well, that opens up a few different sub-theories. But let's start with the theory that she died in the terrorist attacks. First of all was her husband's testimony, which was deemed very credible. Secondly, was there was no direct evidence linking to foul play, and no alternative theories were deemed logical, and while the evidence was very circumstantial, most of it strongly pointed to the fact that her death was connected to the attacks. There was also the fact that she was last seen in the financial district shopping, which is generally a pretty safe place and is heavily populated, making a random attack or abduction unlikely. And if she had planned to go partying somewhere else, why carry around all those shopping bags instead of dropping them back off at home? Although it is possible she left them somewhere at a bar/restaurant to pick them up the next morning, which was then lost in the shuffle of 9/11. Or it's even possible she could have left them with a girl she spent the night with. However, many find it unlikely she died in the terrorist attacks. There was extensive documentation and identification efforts for the victims, and the thought that they couldn't find her remains seems unlikely. It also doesn't seem possible that someone from the medical community who were in abundance at the site of the attacks would not have recognized her being on the scene helping. However, none of them ever came forward to report she was there. So if she didn't die in the attacks, what happened? Well, two of the first theories that jumped out were suicide or accidental death. Maybe the night before, she became depressed that her life seemed to be falling apart and felt there was no other way out. Likewise, some believe she had an accidental death due to drinking, or maybe she OD'd, as there were some reports that stated she was also involved with drugs. What kind and to what extent is unknown. But the problem with either of these is, where is the body? Did someone she was partying with hide it to avoid getting into trouble? However, others think her disappearance could be related to foul play, citing her lifestyle, the night outings, the involvement with other women, and the missing shopping bags could lend to the theory that someone killed her. It's even possible that it was not connected to her lifestyle and was just a random crime that happened at the worst time for investigators. However, the most concerning foul play theory actually involves her brother, who according to some, was responsible due to her sleeping with his girlfriend. This came about because the two had a strained relationship, and her brother gave conflicting statements and in general showed odd behavior. For example, he told reporters and the police that he spoke to her on 9/11 and she was inside the tower right after the attack. And that was a lie. He apparently later claimed he said all of that to get her name out into the news to help search for her, because she was at first not listed as a victim of the attacks. However, some believe he actually stated this so detectives would not connect her disappearance to him. Finally, the last theory speculates she used the chaos of the attacks to disappear and start a new life. Maybe she wanted to come out and live openly as a lesbian, or perhaps she just felt her life was in too much disarray and needed a reset. March 11th, 2011. Residents of northeastern Japan would be in for quite a shock when they began to feel the earth tremble. For 6 minutes, the magnitude 9 earthquake would shake the country and go down as the most powerful earthquake in Japan's history, and the 4th most powerful in world history. And of course, anytime an earthquake hits this close to the ocean, well, it leads to the possibility of another natural disaster, which will be exactly what happened in Japan, because shortly after the earthquake, tsunami waves over 130 feet in height would pound the country. Residents sadly only got an 8 to 10 minute warning, and numerous evacuation sites were washed away. Making it even worse was the snowfall and freezing temperatures that came afterwards, which hampered rescues. In total, close to 20,000 people lost their lives, and many were never found. But just like with other disasters, people rebuild their lives, homes, and their cities. And since 2011, that is what has happened here. However, it's during this time frame of rebuilding that a strange paranormal mystery would occur, because a university sociology student who was doing research as a part of her thesis would interview 100 taxi drivers who had driven during the disaster and simply ask them, had they seen anything unusual in the aftermath of the earthquake and tsunami. Now, a lot of these taxi drivers would just straight up refuse to even talk to her, but 7 of them did get in touch and relayed some strange incidents. One of the earliest involved a young woman who held a cab while wearing a heavy winter coat, despite the weather being warm. The woman would ask "Can you take me to Minimihama, please?" And the driver would reply, "There's nothing at Minamahama anymore." And after a few awkward moments, the woman would question, "Have I died?" This would lead to the taxi driver turning around to see the passenger was no longer there. Another incident involved a young man asking to be taken to Ioriyama Mountain, and when the taxi arrived, the man had vanished, while another incident would record that a passenger asked to be taken to a residential address, but when the driver arrived, the home had been flattened, leading to the taxi driver to question, "Are you sure this is the right place?" And like the others, the passenger had vanished. Some of the other stories often involved passengers who were headless, had missing limbs, or were cut completely in half, and most of the time, they were predominantly young people. Now what makes this one odd compared to other similar stories that we have covered in the past is that all the taxi drivers had started their meter, which is of course typical to do once a passenger gets in, meaning the drivers would have had to cover the cost for these phantom riders, begging the question, were they willing to pay and document these alleged ghost passengers all for a hoax? Of course, the skeptical take is that the drivers were having what is called grief hallucinations, while some psychiatrists have claimed the ghost passengers are signs of PTSD, but there's still those who believe that these drivers really picked up ghosts. November 9th, 1981, 34-year-old Patricia Hesse of small-town Rutland in Vermont would head to the local mall where she would pick up and purchase a $200 fur coat, which is about the equivalent of $700 in today's money. It's from here she would return home where she would begin to make dinner. Now we know very little about this actual mystery, but we do know what happens next, because the landlady would begin to notice something burning in Patricia's apartment and would run up to see what was going on. It's here she would find the kitchen table had been set for dinner, while a new fur coat was hanging in her closet. But that burning smell, the landlady quickly found that it was coming from food burning on the stove. She would then begin to walk around the apartment looking and calling out for Patricia, but alas, she did not find one sign of her. The whole scene was eerie. The next day, Patricia had still not returned home, and accounts are not exactly clear, but at some point that day, her sister would make a call to the police to report her missing, but law enforcement told her they could not begin a search until it had been at least 2 days, which was the standard operating procedure at the time. They did finally go over to her apartment and failed to find one shred of evidence that a crime had been committed, and when her sister viewed the apartment, she was unable to determine if anything had been stolen, and the investigation by the police pretty much stopped here. They had no evidence that a crime had taken place, and Patricia was an adult and had the right to leave without telling anyone. But her sister Pamela knew something was up, and she began to investigate the disappearance on her own. She eventually found enough evidence to convince her that Patricia had been murdered, and she knew by who. She would take this evidence to the police, but stated that even she knew she did not have enough to take it to court, while law enforcement would simply go over the evidence and tell her they had seen nothing that pointed to foul play. Sadly, the case barely got any media attention, and there's not been an update in decades. Her sister Pamela would die in 2005 in an automobile accident, leaving no one to continue the search for Patricia. Now, as I said, this case has almost zero publicly available on it, but there is one odd key that is sometimes overlooked. Apparently, it's believed by police, as well as her sister, that Patricia had potentially been wearing a trench coat when she vanished. Now, is this because it was missing from her residence, or because she had been seen wearing one at the mall? Well, the record isn't clear on that, but of course, it brings up the question, why would she be wearing a trench coat while cooking? Well, obviously, she most likely wasn't, which has led to conjecture she may have walked out of her home voluntarily, and I'm assuming since she left food cooking on the stove, she must have intended to only be gone for a short minute. Maybe she even planned to walk to a neighbor's to borrow some type of food or spice or something like that. Or maybe she even ran out to get something from her car. Whatever the case, since there was no signs of a struggle inside the apartment and her coat was missing, she most likely left voluntarily and something happened then. But the original investigators seemed convinced that there was no foul play, and since Patricia's mother had died 3 years earlier, her father 6 years earlier, along with her brother who had died over a decade before, and a boyfriend who had committed suicide just 10 years earlier, whom Patricia still grieved for. Well, it stands to reason that the police may have thought Patricia had committed suicide, although the fact that a body was never found was odd, or the fact that she decided to do this during the middle of cooking a meal. Then there was the other strange part of this mystery. Apparently, Patricia had not been employed in years and worked only sporadically, leaving many to wonder how was she taking care of her bills, plus buying a $200 fur coat. It is possible she could have gotten some kind of inheritance from her parents, but many wonder if it was an unknown lover who was giving her the money. Maybe she was a mistress to a wealthy married man, and he was afraid she was about to tell his wife. Of course, there's also the theory that she was involved in sex work, and maybe she had planned to meet a client that night. Then you got the theory that she was robbed or abducted after intending to step out of the apartment for a brief period of time. November 1974, a student journalist for the University of Kansas newspaper would pen an interesting article about an alleged haunted churchyard and cemetery in the small community of Stull, Kansas, that would to this day create an enduring legacy. The legends about the Stull Cemetery had been around for over a century before they were recorded to the university newspaper, or at least according to this article. It would then go on to say that although a lot of these stories came from the older generations that had inhabited Stull, many students who went to the cemetery to do paranormal research would have their own experiences, like one student who claimed to have been grabbed by the arm of something unseen, while others would suffer memory loss when visiting the place. There were also all kinds of rumors that the location was home to devil worshipping and witchcraft, but maybe the most interesting was the cemetery in Stull was supposed to be one of the few locations on Earth where a gateway to hell existed, and a spot that the devil came through on 2 occasions each year, one at the spring equinox, the other during Halloween, when the devil is not only supposed to show up, but the spirits of the dead are said to arise from the graves. It took a few years, but these stories really started to circulate, and about 3.5 years later, on March 20th, 1978, more than 150 people went to the cemetery to wait for the devil, but nothing happened. This still did not stop the legend though. As it continued to grow into the 80s, there was at least one account of 2 young men who went to the cemetery one night only to be frightened when a strong wind began blowing out of nowhere, causing the 2 to run back to their car, only to see it had been moved to the other side of the highway facing the opposite direction. While another story claimed a man who was inside the church would experience this same freakish wind and said it was so strong that it knocked him to the floor and kept him pinned down for some time. Likewise, this old crumbling church that had no roof by this point is made more odd by the fact that rainfall will not enter the church and the floors stay dry all year long. Others recounted that bottles thrown up against the church would not break, while a pine tree on the lot was said to be used to hang witches. There were also rumors that the staircase behind the church led to the gateway to hell, with people reporting experiencing time slips there, while nighttime research found lots of strange phenomena, including flashlight malfunctions and mysterious noises. There was even a bizarre claim in the 90s that Pope John Paul II ordered his private plane to fly around eastern Kansas on his way to a public appearance in Colorado because he did not want to fly over unholy ground. According to the tale, it supposedly goes back to the 1850s when the devil first began appearing, when the original town name was Skull, but allegedly later becomes Stull to cover up for the fact that the area was filled with black magic, although, according to the official town history, he was named after the community's first postmaster, Sylvester Stull. By 1988, the biggest crowd ever showed up on Halloween, with close to 500 people. This led to a night of damaging the church and gravestones, which in the years that followed would see the sheriff's department sending deputies out to stop the trespassing, and to this day, they still routinely patrol the area at night, although that has not stopped modern-day ghost hunters, whose creepy experiences can be found on places like Reddit and other forums. But are any of these stories true, or is this just another paranormal legend? Well, according to the most recent interviews of people who still live there, they have never had any of these experiences, and instead blamed the student newspaper for the tale. However, while most of the stories surrounding Stull are no doubt false, there are a couple of odd things that stand out. For one, is the vacant church is badly damaged and had been vacant since 1922. The property owners had spoke out against vandals as well as the so-called paranormal legends surrounding it. However, they refused to tear it down. Secondly, on Halloween night of 1999, reporters from both the newspaper and television crew joined onlookers at the cemetery while sheriff's deputies stood nearby on hand to make sure no one was vandalizing. However, something strange would happen. They allowed everyone to stay until 11:30, when a representative for the cemetery owners appeared and made everyone leave, refusing to allow them to stay until midnight, when the devil was supposed to make his appearance. Finally, in 2002, the church was mysteriously and finally demolished, and it happened to be on a Good Friday no less. And of course, this story ends just as strange, because the man who owned the property, along with two others, stated they did not authorize anyone to demolish it and wanted answers. But apparently, no one in the small community ever seen the demolition take place. So, do you think Stull is a haunted location? Let me know in the comment section below. (1996) Anderson, Indiana. Employees cleaning out a sludge pit at the GMC Delphi Interior and Lighting Plant would make a very peculiar discovery, one of the cryptid variety. At this plant was a tank used to store byproducts and chemicals that in turn would be used to make bumpers. Inside this toxic goo, they found something they could not believe: several grayish-red squids about 6 to 9 inches long, just swimming around inside the sludge, which was made up of oil and antifreeze and other various chemicals. They appeared to be somewhat transparent and resembled real squids, and were about the size of a hand, although they could not tell very much about them, but they could see an eye on at least one of them. The employees were bewildered and took one of the specimens out and put it in a jar in hopes that someone may be able to identify it. However, that specimen, that would later be called the oil pit squid, disappeared without explanation, and the little creature was never able to be officially studied. There's not much on this story, so we'll get right to theories. Starting with the more plausible down-to-earth ones, some of the early conjecture was that it was a massive bacteria growth, or perhaps even a mutated earthworm. There was even the thought it was an undocumented parasite or fish-like creature. Of course, the more paranormal theory is that it was an alien spore, but many think the whole thing was nothing more than a hoax. August 17th, 2010. 21-year-old Amber Tuccaro of Alberta, Canada, and member of the Mikisew Cree First Nation, would fly to Edmonton from Fort McMurray with her 1-year-old son and a female friend for a weekend trip. They planned to spend the night outside the city, where they would then head into Edmonton the next day. But as the day progressed, Amber would decide to go ahead and go into the city that night, and left her 1-year-old with her friend. She would then take off hitchhiking towards the city. However, several hours would pass and Amber did not return, causing her friend to become alarmed, and as night turned to morning, she gave up on waiting for Amber to return and called the RCMP to report her missing. And this is where the whole case gets off to a really bad start, because as we have mentioned in the past on this channel, Canadian law enforcement does not have the best reputation in dealing with missing Indigenous people, especially women. In fact, the RCMP would just come out and state they thought Amber was alive and was just out partying somewhere, and would eventually show back up, and that was pretty much it. But Amber never came back. It would be 2 years later before there would eventually be movement in the case, when the RCMP would reveal they had a key piece of evidence which blew the investigation wide open. They would release this, which was a portion of a phone call that Amber had apparently made while in the car of a man that had picked her up hitchhiking. In it, you can hear the man insisting that he is driving north to 50th Street where Amber wanted to go. Amber would repeat it while still questioning if they were really going that way.
Where are we by?
We're just heading south of Beaumont, or north of Beaumont.
We're heading north of Beaumont. Yo, where are we going?
Just
No, this
the
is a...
road.
Are you f***ing kidding me?
Why not?
You better not take me anywhere I don't want to go. I want to go into the city. Jeez. Yo, we're not going in the city, are we?
We're going
No, we're not.
yes,
Then where the f*** these roads going to?
50th Street.
50th Street. Are you sure?
Absolutely.
Yo, where are we going?
50th Street.
50th Street?
50th Street.
East, right?
East.
Over down.
Travel.
South.
The RCMP now had obviously flip-flopped on their first theory, now believing that, hey, maybe she wasn't partying and something bad happened to her. Actually, they were now very confident the man in this audio was her killer, and yet he has never been identified. Investigators began to theorize, instead of driving her north like Amber wanted to go, he actually took her to the southeast to a rural part of the area on some country roads, and this theory would later be proven right, because on September 1st, 2012, just 2 years after her disappearance, partial skeletal remains were found in a farmer's field near Leduc County, and sadly, it was confirmed to be Amber's. But with the audio of this man on the phone call, someone had to know who he was, right? Well, let's discuss the actual call first, because police have been very tight-lipped about it. In fact, that one little segment we heard is only about a minute long, but the actual phone call is 16 minutes, and law enforcement have never divulged what else was contained in it. Furthermore, the RCMP only got a hold of this phone call because, as it turns out, Amber had a conversation with her brother on the telephone, who was in prison, and who called who varies by the source, but what is known is the facility where her brother was had actually began recording phone calls. Now, as mentioned, whatever else was disclosed in this 15-minute period is being kept close to the vest of investigators, which makes it seem like they know a lot more than they're letting on. But once the phone call was released to the public, detectives would get a hit. Actually, they got a few different hits. When two separate women would call into the RCMP and stated that they recognized the voice on the call. One woman would even state that she had ridden with him on several different occasions, and there was no doubt about it in her mind who this man was. The other woman would also point her finger at the same exact guy, and these women were not connected at all and did not know each other. And making it even more suspicious, some sources state that it was actually more than two women, and instead, several women called in to report they recognized the voice as him. So the RCMP began to look into him, and they were able to rule him out, which was a major disappointment to everyone involved, and the case would drag on. And by 2014, Amber's family would file a complaint on the RCMP for their mishandling of the case, and they seemed to be justified, because after the complaint, a commission looked into the RCMP's investigation and concluded it was deficient, citing untrained or poorly trained members of law enforcement blowing the case from the get-go. They made an absolute massive amount of mistakes. First of all was the biggest error. They just flat out refused to search for her until a month after she disappeared, which of course delayed interviews with potential witnesses, as well as probably losing out on other witnesses altogether. On top of this, her belongings she had left at the hotel room, which might have held evidence, were accidentally destroyed by the police. But that wasn't all. They even removed her name from the missing persons list soon after she disappeared, for some unexplained reason. And then, they didn't even reach back out to her mother until 4 months after she had reported her missing. But let's get back to what this case really hinges on. That eerie phone call. The man's accent has been described as sounding like he might be from the American Midwest, which sounds very similar to the Canadian prairie accent. So while it was speculated early on that he may be American, that line of thinking has changed. It was also believed he was driving around deliberately, taking many different back roads to confuse Amber, and as mentioned, several women came forward claiming it was a notorious local man who had been in and out of trouble with the law and had a history of violence against women. He also owned a horse ranch in a rural area outside of Edmonton in the general location where her remains were found. and for whatever reason, police were able to rule him out. So, with this man seemingly ruled out, what's left? As it should be no surprise, many online sleuths believe that the abductor/killer had some kind of connections to law enforcement, citing the delayed release of the audio recording and the extremely slow progress at the beginning of the investigation. Around the early 2000s, a woman walking along a trail picking flowers in Malise, Switzerland, would have a strange encounter that would lead to this next urban legend/unsolved mystery. The woman would be stunned to see this tall humanoid being dressed in what she described as a bowler suit, with a cloak and gas mask which covered his entire head. Apparently, he was just as startled to see her as she was him, and quickly walked off into the woods. But this would not be the last sighting, because over the next decade, this individual would be spotted numerous times in the forest near the village, where he is almost always described as wearing a dark bowler suit with a greenish camouflage cloak, and of course, wearing the gas mask which covers his entire head. By September 2013, a French newspaper would publish the first known photograph of this being that at this point had become known as the Loyon. The photograph went viral since many people had been hearing of this legend for decades. According to the photographer, he ran across him in the forest and seen him in his cape, boots, and mask, and Le Loyon turned around and looked at him and walked away in silence. That's when this photographer then snapped the picture, and it was soon after this that the gas mask and cloak would be found in the forest along with a note, presumably by the stranger, entitled Death Certificate and Testament of the Ghost of Malise. In the note, he referred to his forest hikes as his happiness therapy, and claimed he knew about the photograph going viral and was not happy with the attention it brought the forest. And ever since this note, he has never been sighted again, leading some to think he may have committed suicide. So what to make of this one? Well, many seem to think this was just a strange local who liked to go on walks in the forest and for whatever reason, wear a costume while doing so. But after the attention he got, he discarded it and walks without it now. Of course, others think that it might have been a mentally ill person, or someone who had some kind of skin issues on his face, or maybe even someone practicing survival techniques, while some still think the whole thing is an urban legend. June 1985, 15-year-old Marco Aurélio of Sao Paulo, Brazil, was excited to be going on a camping trip with his friends where they planned to climb Pico dos Marins, a mountain close to 8,000 feet high. Marco had just made senior scout, and he was ready to put his skills to test. His twin brother was supposed to have went along with him, but dropped out after getting sick. So on the 6th, the night before the trip, the leader of the group, a Juan Bernabeu Cespedes, would go to the home of Marco Aurélio and have dinner with his family, as he was very close to Marco's father, and they had all taken trips together before. Juan would spend the night with them, and the next morning, his father and brother would accompany them to the train station where they met 3 other boys about Marco's age and were also going along as scouts, that of Ricardo Salvioni, Osvaldo Liberio, and Ramatus Rome. They would depart and finally reach their destination and began their hike into the base camp. It was there they would meet a local guide named Afonso Xavier, who was an expert on the area and was supposed to go with them. He gave them a space to settle in, which is right next to his home near the trail. The boys then set up their tents around 2 p.m. and afterwards, the 5 of them went for a swim in the nearby river. And here's where things get a bit odd. Upon getting out of the river and going back up on the bank, Juan, the group's leader, would notice that everyone's belongings had been rifled through. He would ask the local guide about it, Afonso, and his excuse was that it was probably due to some of the local dogs running around. The crew shook it off, and as it started to get dark, the temperature would drop and the men made a fire, had dinner, and talked about the hike for the next day. And the tired campers lay down hoping to get some much needed rest. But the next morning when they got up, they had not gotten a full night's peaceful sleep. As they were getting their stuff together, someone would finally break the ice about something mysterious that had happened the night before. Apparently, one of the younger scouts, Osvaldo, stated when he was trying to sleep, he actually seen someone walking around through the camp, and this someone was not anyone with their party, so he got scared and kept quiet. After bringing this up, Juan, the leader of the expedition, would then also confirm that someone had hit his tent during the night. Juan then jumped up and out of his tent to see who it was, but he seen nothing, and he rationalized, maybe for the boy's sake, or maybe for himself, that it was probably the son of the local guide, Afonso, whose house sat nearby. He thought it was possible he tried to play a practical joke on them. So now that they were calm again, they had breakfast and began to head up the steep climb of the mountain, a journey that typically takes around 5 hours. The first part of the journey was pretty uneventful, but as they got around 4,000 feet high, Osvaldo would accidentally step into a hole, injuring his knee, and damaged it enough to make it impossible for him to walk. The young scouts would create a makeshift stretcher to haul him back to camp, which would still take a while, but the brave Marco would offer to walk ahead of everyone and cut a clear path, so they could return quicker and in turn get Osvaldo help much quicker. Osvaldo, however, was against this, citing one of the major rules of the forest, never split up, but Marco insisted, and Juan, the group leader, strangely authorized it. But before he went, he told Marco he should take a piece of chalk with him and mark the stones on the way with the number 240, which is the number that identified their scout group. Marco agreed and moved out ahead, chopping while the others slowly brought Osvaldo behind. They followed the chalk-marked path for a ways, passing 3 stones with a 240 marking. It was here that they would come to a fork in the road, and they quickly spotted Marco's chalk marking to the left, but Juan couldn't understand why he had chosen the left-hand path because there were obstacles in the way that would definitely hamper the 3 in carrying Osvaldo. Juan thought about it and decided they should take the right-hand path, although all of the other boys argued against this, and all stated they should follow Marco. Juan was now in a bad spot, well, worse than he already was in, and to calm the boys down, he told them both trails met back together anyways, so it didn't matter because they would run into Marco. And none of this was true, although I can't find if Juan straight up lied about it or he just didn't know. He also reportedly told them that even if Marco got lost, he would only be temporarily because you can clearly see the city from the mountain and all you have to do is walk in that direction. Regardless, it was a dumb decision because it put them on a much longer route. Osvaldo had fell at 2 p.m. that afternoon, and it would take them until 5 a.m. until they reached camp. And making things worse was the freezing temperatures that came along with the early morning hour. The crew, exhausted, expected to find Marco, but just like everything else on this hike, expect the unexpected, because Marco was not asleep in his tent, although, strangely, his backpack was open outside the tent, and since all 5 of them had left their backpacks neatly organized inside their tent, it meant most likely that Marco had returned, looked for something in his bag, and went back out, or it meant someone else had snooped through his bag. Regardless, Juan now had huge problems. Although exhausted, he went straight back out onto the trail to find Marco, where he spent the next 5 hours combing the area for him and found nothing. Finally, he gave up and rushed to call authorities. The search was massive, one of the biggest in Brazil's history up to that point. For over a month, over 300 people searched the area. That included the military police, army infantry, firefighters, climbers, bushmen, guides, rescue specialists, volunteers, dogs, helicopter, and 1 plane. But even after that, nothing was found. It was like he vanished into thin air, along with anything he had on or anything he was carrying. One of the guides who was even helping in the search stated they covered the area so thoroughly that if he was not found, it's because he's not anywhere on that mountain. Although the search would never find anything, there was one odd thing that occurred on the 3rd day of the search. That was a large fire that broke out in the area. Some questioned if it had been intentionally set to hinder the search, but that was never proven. So, what happened? Well, theories vary, but of course, much of the finger-pointing went to the leader and only adult, Juan. How could a scout leader with so much experience on the trails do something as dumb as leaving a teenager to hike into a place he did not know? Well, detectives thought he was not that dumb, and they actually found some inconsistencies in his interrogation, although Juan claimed he was tortured, so that could be where they came from. But there has been speculation that Marco's disappearance was sexually motivated, and that Juan had abused and then killed him. But to me, that just creates a lot of other problems. None of the other boys reported this, and all of them told the same story. Osvaldo got hurt, they made a stretcher to carry him on, then Juan instructed Marco to make marks on the stones as he went ahead. So if this alleged abuse was going on, it doesn't seem like it was happening on this trip at least. But there are some other things that stand out. Remember Afonso, the specialized guide that lived right next to the trail? Well, he was supposed to accompany them to the top of the mountain, but when it came time, Juan dismissed him. When asked about this, Juan told the police that he had heard Afonso didn't have time to accompany them. But Afonso and his wife told detectives he had already been packing and was ready for the trip when Juan told him not to come. There was also another group hiking in the area at the time and asked if they would like to go along with them, and Juan turned them down, as well as letting Marco hike alone, cause if Marco had found help for Osvaldo, how could they get back to him with Juan taking him on a different path? But maybe the biggest red flag was when they made it back to camp at 2 a.m. Why didn't Juan go to Afonso, whose house literally sat 160 feet off the trail, and ask, "Hey, have you seen Marco?" Or, "Can you come help me look for him?" Instead of doing that, he immediately turned around and went back out onto the trail by himself, where he would be for a long 5 hours before he returned back, claiming he found no sign of Marco. That was very suspicious. The investigation also found witnesses who just didn't paint Juan's character in the best possible light. He apparently had been expelled from the leadership of a previous scout group for misconduct, such as he did not comply with scouting regulations, he was an authoritarian, threatened the boys, and did not accept being reprimanded. He was also described as acting cold and had a strange way of behaving, while he was also described as making mistakes on purpose. But at the end of the day, there just wasn't any hard physical proof that he had done anything malicious, and police couldn't arrest him. In fact, they originally closed the case, stating that Marco ran away, and for many years believed he was alive and living off the grid, maybe as a wanderer, as some sightings of him were reported in other parts of the country. Then the theory was proposed that maybe a wild animal could be responsible, most likely a jaguar, but since there were no remains that were found, that was ruled out. Then there was the thought that Marco just ventured too far off the trail and maybe fell into a hidden crevice, or maybe just died from dehydration or exposure and was not found. Although the searchers were adamant they looked everywhere, with the dense forest terrain, it could conceal a body, even with extensive search efforts. Detectives then began to suspect foul play by someone not with the hikers. In fact, remember how I said Osvaldo thought he'd seen someone walking around through camp? Well, he would also tell detectives that he felt like they were being watched the entire time they had been out there, and considering someone had also tampered with their bags while swimming and possibly even messed with Marco's bag while he was gone, and then Juan saying that somebody was hitting his tent, well, it couldn't be ruled out that they were being stalked, and Marco was then abducted. Actually, one 10-year-old boy would come forward and state he'd seen Marco inside a truck with a license plate from a city about a 2-hour drive away. He stated the driver was disabled and the passenger was an Asian woman. Amazingly, the license plate number he gave actually corresponded with the real vehicle in the city, but when police checked, they found they were nowhere near the area the day Marco disappeared. In addition, detectives could not find any proof that Marco had been abducted. Then, we turned to a little crazier theory, one that was speculated a lot in the 80s, and that was that a cult was involved. Specifically, a cult called the Blue Butterfly supposedly kidnapped him. In fact, Afonso, the local guide, would even state later on that he had seen members of the cult walking through the woods the night before Marco disappeared. Detectives again ran down this lead and found nothing. But I saved the craziest theory for last, because in this one, it seems that the involvement of extraterrestrials was actually looked at. It starts with the area, which supposedly is a hot spot for UFOs, but the really strange part was, on the second night of the search, the teenagers who had been on a hike with Marco were sitting in Afonso's house near the trail where Marco vanished. They would hear a scream, and then a whistle coming from the forest, and, knowing that Boy Scouts had whistles, they thought it might be Marco, so they took off running outside, but when they went out, they instead seen blue flashes of light that went on and off 3 times. The boys did shout and whistle towards the location it came from, but got no response, and then vanished. UFOlogists claim this could have been the moment Marco was abducted, while Afonso, who also seen the lights, dismissed the UFO claims and stated the lights were coming from houses far away in the region. By the late 2010s, the case was reopened again due to new evidence popping up that suggested Marco was killed and buried right in the area where they camped at. However, after following this lead up and searching the area, no remains were found, and the case has been unsolved for almost 40 years. March 17th, 1995, Pickering, Ontario. A group of 6 teenage boys, 17-year-old Jay Boyle, 18-year-old Chad Smith, 17-year-old Robbie Rumbolt, 17-year-old Michael Cummings, 16-year-old Danny Higgins, and 17-year-old Jamie Lefebvre would go to a party in a neighborhood where teens, like a lot their age, would start drinking. After hanging out at the party a while, they would leave and begin walking back through the neighborhood, and what would occur within the next few hours has led to decades of disagreements on what really happened that fateful night. What we do know is about 3:30 a.m., 2 different girls who said they were the girlfriends of 2 of the boys and had went to the party with them called the police to report all of the boys had vanished. Now, the officer that ended up taking the call was a man named James Gillam, who worked for the Durham Regional Police Service. He first asked the young girls to get a hold of the boys' mothers so they could file an official report, and since the girls had no idea where the boys had went to, or where they were last seen, the officer could not do much since he had no general area to search. And while all of this is understandable, the officer would then get off the phone and tag the report as false, citing that no one was really in danger and he was done with it. Now, why he did this is something we will come back to later. However, a day and a half later, the Durham Police, along with the Coast Guard and Toronto Marine Unit, would begin searching. They were joined by aircraft and helicopters from a local air and sea rescue, as well as hundreds of volunteers who helped search, but yet, not one body or piece of clothing was found. Now, we all know the disappearance of 6 people at once is very rare, but it's not unusual when a large body of water, like Lake Ontario, is nearby, and the police actually had some info that kinda pointed to that. In fact, the morning the boys went missing, police would receive a call that 2 boats were missing. One of these was a 13-foot imitation Boston whaler and a 3-wheeled paddle boat. As detectives went out to investigate the missing boats, they would soon find security video of 3 of the boys walking around the marina. So now the police, although they still didn't have much to go on, stated that the case was basically solved. Their conclusion was that 6 drunk youths broke into a building at this marina, stole 2 boats, took a ride out onto the lake, and met their demise due to an accident enabled by alcohol. And you have to admit, that's not a bad theory. And I just have to note here as well, now that detectives knew the boats were missing, and the police had came up with the theory that the boys had stole it, well, now the officer who had taken the original call and wrote down that the girls were lying and that the boys were safe, yeah, now he decided to file his report, almost a week after the girls had called it in. But there were other inconsistencies. For one, why is it that only 3 of the boys appear in the video? Secondly, it doesn't actually show them stealing anything. In fact, it doesn't even show them breaking in. And it was actually when the families of the boys asked to watch the video that the 3 teens, Jamie, Robbie, and Michael, were identified. But what makes it strange is when they asked to watch the video again, the police denied their request. The families would have to basically make the equivalent of a FOIA request to be able to watch the video again, along with 16 other hours that it recorded. It was only then that they discovered that the other 3 boys never make an appearance in the area. Not only that, the 3 boys who do show up make their appearance at 1:48 a.m., and then just minutes later, at 2:10 a.m., 2 females and 1 male would enter the frame. It's then that this unidentified male suddenly moves ahead, turns back to the girls, and points to something in the distance. These 3 people have never been identified, and nobody knows what they were doing there, nor what it was he seen or heard in the distance. The parents were not happy because in the official file on this case, they completely left that part out, and if not for the request made by the parents, the public would not even know about it. But it gets worse, because at 2:21 a.m., just 2 minutes after these people are recorded, the main security camera, the one that has the best view and gets the most important footage on the dock, just goes off, and it's never been established if someone turned it off on purpose or if the camera failed. There's also some evidence to suggest that the police had a strained relationship with one or more of the boys. Although it's not officially stated which one, it's most likely Jay Boyle, who had been arrested and done time previously for an assault charge, as well as he was still facing more assault and weapons charges. So with these charges, detectives also believe Jay was the type of person who would be capable of breaking and entering and stealing, which led investigators to just quickly close the case, citing the boys went on a drunk joyride that cost them their lives. Of course, Jay's family and friends state in spite of the assault charges, he was not one to steal. But we all know that friends and family can be biased, and to the detectives' credit, they did find local residents who all heard the sound of a motorboat the night they disappeared. However, there's still the issue that if they did drown, there's been very little in the way of proof that they did. In fact, 3 years after the incident, human remains and red jeans were found near Niagara River. This was important because this is the exact color jeans Jay was wearing that night. However, DNA test would eventually rule out the possibility that it was him. Other than that, the only evidence ever found was a gas tank that washed up near Wilson, New York, some 2 hours away. That tank was later thought to have come from the stolen boat, although that wasn't conclusive either. Now the reason we even know any of this is because of FOIA request made by the parents and the work of a recently deceased private investigator named Bruce Ricketts, who also wrote a book about the strange case. He is the one that uncovered the sketchy things we went over, like the slow law enforcement reaction, the officer writing off the initial reports as being nothing, the strained relationship between one of the boys and law enforcement. It's him that tracked the case for years and really brought out a lot of info. He always speculated there was a drug connection related to the incident, citing the drug smuggling that went on between Durham and New York. Another odd thing about this whole case is the boat itself. That Boston Whaler, or the replica, is a boat that supposedly is almost impossible to sink or capsize. They are often called unsinkable, as they will remain above water even if swamped or overturned. Although, if they had taken a steep turn, it could have tossed all the boys out, who then drowned or succumbed to hypothermia. But the fact the boat was never found is very odd. However, the police still to this day cite the simplest answer is the most likely. 6 drunk teenagers going on a joyride and had an accident in the lake and drowned. And as far as the other 3 boys never appearing on camera, they probably waited somewhere else for the others to break in. The circus, with its animals, cotton candy, games, etc., was a much bigger deal in the old days, when many small towns had basically no forms of entertainment available, and it was a circus where our next mystery begins. In the year 1904, in Kansas City, Missouri, and as the circus was leaving town, they would pack up and start putting the numerous crates on board a train, along with the cages used to house lions, tigers, and numerous other wild animals, and it headed off to the next town where they planned to set up again. The ride started off like any other and did not stand out in any way, but shortly after they left Kansas City, there would be a problem, as something had happened to the train tracks which caused many of the train cars to jump around, which in turn violently shook some of the cages of the animals. Unfortunately, some were injured, and some even escaped. The animals would then quickly be chased down and captured and brought back, all except for one, that of the circus's top feature, a 12-foot gorilla, which allegedly had escaped into the countryside. But since the circus did not want any trouble with the authorities, they quickly loaded back up and went into the next town, thinking the gorilla could not survive long in terrain they are not accustomed to. But according to the legend, that's just what happened, and really, this one is a story that kinda just looks fictitious from the get-go. First of all, there are no 12-foot gorillas, as they are basically around 5 foot tall. But the legend gets crazier because of the sightings that pop up after this that would go on for decades. Now I have to clarify here, this escaped gorilla is not responsible for those sightings. Not directly at least. Instead, this gorilla supposedly would mate with another animal in the area that would then spawn into what is known as the Beaman Monster. Beaman being the community that it was spotted in Kansas City, Missouri. The Beaman Monster is described as a huge hairy beast with the body of a gorilla and head of a wolf that is downright terrifying. That's right, this gorilla supposedly mated with the wolf to create a wolf/Bigfoot hybrid, one that is bipedal. Now although this sounds ridiculous, there have been sightings for years, and even stranger, it once led to an organized hunt to find the creature in the 1950s after years of having livestock killed. One story in particular cited a mauled pig that had been found with no normal animal footprints left behind, but this organized hunt never found the cryptid. But dead livestock, large footprints, and mysterious figures sighted in the woods were not the only accounts of this beast. There was also more vivid stories of encounters with it. One came from a boy that traveled with his uncle down a country road in a truck to see a large wolf-like beast jump out and lunge at the truck, nearly scaring him to death. Another tale came from a man who recalled when he was 12, him and another boy digging for worms to use for fishing one morning, and they came across a spot where an animal had obviously used it to lay down. They at first thought it was a deer, but soon discovered these huge footprints that led from the spot down to a pond where they stopped. So, is this just another cryptid legend, or is there any truth to it? Well, for one, an escaped gorilla probably wouldn't last very long in the forests of Missouri and Kansas. Secondly, is the spawning with a wolf is just too much to be believed. But what is possible is the train story was just wrongly connected to the sightings of the cryptid. In fact, there's actually no documentation that a train crash ever happened there, so it's possible that people really just misidentified a Bigfoot, or, more likely, a dogman. Of course, that's if those creatures even exist. It's way more likely that the sightings have just been a misidentified animal, like a big wolf or coyote. October 1987, 43-year-old Patsy Wright of Arlington, Texas, would take some NyQuil and lay down for the night, a routine she did every time before laying down to sleep. But tonight was a little different, because after taking the medicine, she began to feel nauseous. She would call her sister Sally Horning around 3 a.m. and was frantic, and told her she did not feel well and could not breathe, that something was really wrong, and in the middle of the call, Patsy collapsed. Of course, Sally was extremely worried, so her and her husband Steve quickly drove over to check on her. When they walked into the front door, they quickly spotted her laying down in the bedroom floor as if she had fainted. They assumed that was probably the case and began trying to revive her, but it did not work. Steve would quickly jump into action and started CPR. They would note that the green fluid, the NyQuil, would start to come up, and Steve would turn to spit it out onto a towel nearby. While trying to resuscitate her, medics finally showed up, but they too were unable to save her. Sally and Steve would then tell the paramedics about the strange call they had received and the code medicine. It didn't take long for Patsy to be pronounced dead. The family was dumbfounded. How did this happen? She had been so healthy, and no one expected her to have a heart attack or something like that at 43. But these things do happen. However, the lab technician, upon doing a routine autopsy 8 days later, would actually find something disturbing. In Patsy's blood samples was strychnine, a poison that gives someone a terribly excruciating death, which is why sales are strictly controlled by the federal government, and there's very few places you can actually get it, making it all the stranger. After the news came out, Sally, her sister, would then tell detectives that when Patsy had called, she mentioned taking her cold syrup before bed. Detectives would then find the medicine and have it tested, and sure enough, there were huge amounts of strychnine that had been put in it. Detectives quickly ruled out random product tampering, as the medicine had been used previously by Patsy. Secondly, they ruled out suicide after a psychological profile was made up for her, citing her to be very happy. She had 2 children she was close to and adored, and also owned 2 wax museums with Sally worth millions of dollars, and she recently had bought 3 racehorses she was excited to begin training, which led detectives to believe the poison most likely came from someone Patsy knew very well, because not only had the burglar alarm not been set, but only those close to Patsy knew she took a nighttime cold medicine before bed. So now the lead detective on the case began putting together a timeline of events, and found that on the night of her murder, Patsy had went to a dress rehearsal for a Halloween show at the museum. She left around 9 p.m. and went to a bar with a friend, and then came home. Once there, she made and received several long-distance phone calls, put on her pajamas, took the medicine, and went to bed. Of course, the first people detectives would turn to was her sister and brother-in-law. Since the 2 museums were owned by both Patsy and Sally, upon death of either sister, the full ownership would go to the other, which of course led detectives to think that Sally and her husband Stephen were responsible for the death. In fact, in talking to Patsy's friends, they quickly found out that Patsy could not stand Steve. It infuriated her that he had spent Sally's inheritance and then drove them into debt. She actually had already tried to make arrangements that if anything were to happen to her or Sally, Steve would not get any of the money. She was even set to meet with Sally about it, but was murdered before she could. She even told someone she did not want Steve anywhere around her. But when they got to looking at it more, the police kinda started backpedaling on this idea, because when Steve was giving Patsy CPR, it was just possible he could have also ingested the strychnine, killing himself. Detectives didn't think he would take that risk, but the paramedics would tell the lead detective when they performed CPR, a clear liquid came out of Patsy's mouth, not a green one. Furthermore, he stated whoever did the CPR beforehand did not do it correctly, leading to the thought that maybe Steve pretended to do CPR. However, going against this was both Steve and Sally voluntarily took polygraphs and passed. Detectives next turned to her love life. She dated a man named Larry Todd, but it wasn't that serious because she dated others as well, and all of these were cleared quickly. They then talked to her ex-boyfriend, Leo Fikes, as he owned a chemical company and had been madly in love with Patsy, but he passed the polygraph as well, and it was soon found his company did not have access to strychnine. But detectives weren't through, because they soon turned to another man that had been in Patsy's life, her ex-husband, Robert Cox, who refused to take a polygraph. After years of verbal abuse and Robert gambling away all of his money, they separated after a counselor advised Patsy to leave him, citing that Robert was a sociopath. Patsy had to get a restraining order against him because he kept harassing her, and some of her friends told police that she was afraid of him. She believed he had been following her, parking near her home and just watching, and he also told her he would ruin her, and even stated he knew people that could snuff someone out. Even stranger, she was set to testify against him in an upcoming civil suit between him and his insurance company, as he had a warehouse that had burned down in a fire and claimed it was an accident, but the insurance company believed he burned it himself to collect the money. He had been pleading with Patsy to change her testimony, but she stated she planned to tell the truth. Patsy would be murdered 10 days before that trial, and Robert won that case. But there was zero proof that he was actually responsible, and plus, there was another clue that came up that might have absolved him. While police were looking over the scene originally, they noted how 2 empty dinner plates had been left on a tray, which sat next to the bed, which obviously implied there was a visitor with her that evening. Now I know things can happen, but if Robert and Patsy's relationship had been that strained, it's hard to see a situation where they end up in bed together having dinner. So detectives were now wondering who this unidentified person was. However, it's also been pointed out that 2 plates does not necessarily mean 2 people. In fact, many people use separate plates for separate food items. Maybe this is what Patsy was doing that night. Not to mention, in the weeks prior, Patsy had told her sister that the spare key she kept inside her home above the oven had vanished, so it's possible the killer took them out and came by when Patsy was not there and then set the poison. Now, after searching through her love life, they looked at more of her contacts from the business world, and Patsy's family would actually put the detectives onto a couple they believed were involved. It was that of Bill and Bonnie Alexander. Now, the Alexanders had offered to house and feed the racehorses that Patsy had bought, for a fee, obviously. The day before Patsy died, she had written them a check, and the day after she died, the Alexanders would go fill in their own amount, $4,000, or about $11,000 in today's money, and then they went and cashed the check. Furthermore, after all this, it was found out that the Alexanders had somehow gotten the horses put into their names. However, the Alexanders disputed all this, telling them that Patsy gave them a blank check and told them to add up the fees and to fill in the check accordingly. And as far as the horses being in their names, it turns out, according to the Alexanders, Patsy done this in case something happened to her, so Steve would not get possession of the horses. Still, Patsy's family would go on to claim that Bill had came on to her and she rebuffed him, which led to him killing Patsy, or Bonnie doing it out of jealousy. Of course, there was no proof for this, but the detective did find that the horse breeders sometimes used strychnine to treat animals. Regardless, both Bill and Bonnie passed polygraphs. But it gets weirder still. The morning after the murder, her daughter would get a call from a woman asking for Patsy, and her daughter, not wanting to tell anyone she had just died, asked to take a message, but the person would not give one, and instead insisted she must talk to Patsy. Finally, her daughter stated, "I'm sorry, Patsy has passed away." The woman replied, "Well, good, I wanted her dead," and then hung up. Making this mystery even more convoluted was the death of Patsy's secretary, 26-year-old Loyon Williams, who, in September 1984, 3 years prior to Patsy's death, went home complaining of stomach pains. Doctors removed her appendix, but found it to be healthy, and then Loyon died 11 days later due to complications from the surgery. However, her symptoms were very similar to arsenic poisoning. And I know this story seems insane so far, but it gets worse. A year later, on September 9th, 1988, one of the two wax museums, which now both belong to Sally, caught fire and burned down, with tons of wax figures and antiques being destroyed with it. First, it was ruled as a faulty electrical box, but later, that was changed to undetermined, and many investigators thought it was arson, possibly caused by an accelerant. 2 weeks later, on the 24th, police would notice a man combing through the debris of the museum, and when he noticed the police were watching, he picked up a financial ledger book from the business office and bolted. He then tossed the ledger into a bush and made his escape, but police were able to write down his license plate number. He was soon identified as 21-year-old Stanley Pointer, a drifter. He occasionally had low-paying jobs, although he somehow lived a comfortable lifestyle. He had been arrested for arson before. He disappeared, but was arrested the following year, and they questioned him about the fire and Patsy and Loyon's death, which he obviously denied. He stated he thought the ledger was a museum piece he had intended to steal. 4 days later, he was released because no links were found between him and the murder. And that's pretty much it. This is one of those cases that didn't suffer from having no suspects. It suffered from having way too many. In our time of discussing mysteries, we have looked at several paranormal stories involving haunted homes and, in some cases, haunted items. But this next one is a potential cursed item that I can personally see being haunted. On June 1st, 2010, a video uploaded to YouTube by a man named Sean Robinson would display a piece of art that he stated he had gotten from his grandmother that had apparently just sat in her attic for 25 years. The oil painting is that of a humanoid figure from the collarbone up with a blue background. It's painted in shades of red, and the individual seems to be badly burned or maybe even filleted. It has no hair, but it does have 2 holes where the eyes should be, and a mouth that is wide open as if it is screaming in agony. Most chillingly, the painting is said to be a mixture of blood with paint, or at least, according to his grandmother who gave him the painting. She would also relay that the artist committed suicide shortly after finishing it. Now, his grandmother had originally hidden the painting in the attic because she stated after getting it, she started hearing strange noises and crying, as well as seeing a dark figure of a man inside the home. Steve would state shortly after getting the painting, he would place it in his basement, and his family began to see the dark silhouette of a man walking around, as well as hearing the cries of agony in the home, and the noises got worse and closer. At times it sounded like it was right in the bedroom with them. The dark figure got closer as well, and Sean would report waking up one night to see the figure, which resembled a middle-aged man, at the foot of his bed, staring at him and his wife. Sean, who was always a skeptic before, began setting up cameras during the night to try and catch what was going on. Between 1 and 5 a.m., it picked up banging noises, and one night, around 3:25 a.m., it captured the painting just falling over. Steve would temporarily have to move in to his parents for unrelated reasons, but oddly took the painting with him. Again, the same phenomena continued to happen, and one night, his father even fell down the stairs. After that, he moved the painting to storage. He would bring in paranormal experts to look at it, who studied it and witnessed strange events, and at one point, conducted a seance where a spirit allegedly interacted with the painting. Still, most to this day, think the paranormal aspect is nothing more than a hoax by Steven. In fact, it is worth noting that Steven is represented by a studio, meaning the whole thing could be a viral campaign for a film or something like that. March 4th, 1998, 11-year-old Pedro Teixeira Mendonça of Lousada, Portugal, would grab his bicycle at 2 p.m. and go by his mother's office, which was just across the street from their home, and ask her if he could tag along with his 21-year-old truck driving friend, Afonso Diaz. His mother was a bit uncomfortable with the age gap, so she told him no and to go play in the field behind the office where a horse racing track was. A few hours later, at 5:30 p.m., Pedro's parents would get a phone call that would shake their world up. Upon answering the phone, they would be greeted by Pedro's tutor, who told them he never showed up for his 5 p.m. appointment, and he thought it was strange because he had never missed a session before. The parents wasted no time and immediately began a search. They would call friends, neighbors, and family to form a search party, first going over to the field behind his mother's office, where he was last seen riding a bicycle, and they didn't find him. But they did find his bicycle, as it had been hidden in some bushes next to the horse track. So logically, his mother thought back a few hours prior and knew they had to find Afonso, the older friend who was going to take Pedro along with him. They would eventually find him and ask him if he had seen the young boy, and in a cool, calm manner, he replied he had not, which that tone definitely set off alarm bells. And it wasn't long until police, who were now involved in the investigation, found several people that all claimed to have seen Afonso talking to him at the horse race track behind his mother's office while sitting in a black car, actually his brother's car, and it had been spotted exactly where the bicycle had been found. Now, as it turns out, Afonso's brother had loaned him the car for the day, as Afonso was supposed to take it to get it inspected, but upon calling the mechanic, investigators found out Afonso never showed up, and instead, apparently just drove around aimlessly all day. That's when the police had heard enough and took him into interrogation. After a while, they would bring him back out, and he was confronted by the members of the family, and Afonso would begin crying and told them he did not know where Pedro was, but that the police should close the borders as he was probably far away on his way to another country, which was pretty foreboding. But it would get worse, because Pedro's young cousin Andre would then also confront him, and Afonso would actually threaten him, telling him to shut up. But Andre went on and told of a conversation the boys had with Afonso earlier that day. Apparently, he had offered to take the two young boys to meet a prostitute, but Andre's mother did not allow him to go, and although Pedro's mother had told him not to go, he either snuck out and done it or was forced to go. By this point, the police in Portugal, whose claim to fame is bungling the Madeleine McCann case and never catching the Lisbon Ripper, would continue being useless because they refused to investigate the case as a kidnapping and still conducted it as a search and rescue, thinking he had wandered too far off the path and got hurt somewhere, but the story was just reaching the press and it was going to be a big one. People who began seeing the news would start overwhelming the family with phone calls, offering clues, sometimes just trying to help, other times just wasting time, while some called claiming to be in possession of Pedro. One haunting phone call in particular was from a boy who sounded just like Pedro, and he kept calling for his mother non-stop until someone took the phone away from him and disconnected it. The police, for their part, decided to keep being useless and did not pursue any of these calls, and the story continued to get more insane because just a month later, a journalist named Nuno Rogero would do a report on Disneyland Paris for a magazine, and as he was going over the photos he took, he found one that stood out. In it, on Pinocchio Tunnel, was a little boy next to a man dressed in red, and that little boy looked a lot like Pedro. So much so that his mother believed it was him. The police would come and take the pictures and did nothing with them. But then again, maybe they were able to rule out a connection. But you can look at the picture here and make your own call. But 6 months after his disappearance, the case would take a dark turn. Now because this is YouTube, I can't go into a lot of details here, so I'm just going to brush over it and let you fill in the blanks. But in September of that year, the British police would bust up a criminal ring known as the Wonderland Club, which operated mostly online, where they shared a database of thousands of pictures and videos that they should not have, if you catch my drift. Some of the photos had even been taken by one of the pervs in this group and was then shared. But what is crucial to our story is British police found a picture of Pedro here. They feared, along with Interpol, that he had been abused and murdered. In fact, a face photo would then be shown to his mother, who confirmed it was him. But of course, Portuguese authorities, who are just getting really hard to make fun of at this point, would claim that the photo was not Pedro. Now this, in spite of the fact that Interpol, who is one of the top law enforcement agencies in the world and have specialists specifically for this role, and only identified 16 of the children in these thousands of photographs, with one of them being Pedro. Yet, the Portuguese officials just refused to believe it. Instead, the Portuguese authorities stated since he was last seen with Afonso, then he was the one responsible for his disappearance. Which, yeah, that makes sense, but it was like they couldn't connect the dots, or maybe they refused to. Regardless, a sex worker had apparently also came forward shortly after the abduction and told police a key clue, and they blew her off. But she would prove pivotal years later. According to her, Alcina Davis, Afonso brought Pedro to her, and upon meeting with Alcina, he would offer her money to sleep with Pedro. Alcina knew something wasn't right, as he was crying, so the two went off into the woods, and she asked him what was wrong, and he said Afonso made him go when he didn't want to, and his mom didn't know he was there. The two would then sit calmly for about 15 minutes, having no contact. She walked him back to the car, and they left, and Alcina believed they stopped at a brothel just a little bit down the road. From here, Afonso was next officially spotted when he arrives at his girlfriend's place at 6:45 p.m. But this wasn't the only witness. Several of Pedro's friends would go tell police that Afonso had been obsessed with him for the past few weeks, and that they had seen him get into the car that day, as they were supposed to play soccer, but he instead left with Afonso. However, his friends too were ignored for years, until 2011, when they, like Alcina, finally were able to testify against Afonso. Unfortunately, the only thing they could charge him with was corruption of a minor, and he would serve out 2 years and was released. Afonso, for his part, always denied the allegations, and instead cited that Pedro never even got into his car that day, and that instead, he drove to a nearby city where he sat in front of a pharmacy for a while, got out, walked around town, and did a little bit of window shopping before going to his girlfriend's. To this day, the most pointed to theory is that Afonso, acting on the behalf of someone else, trafficked him to this underground organization, or someone else, where he was then murdered. Where his remains ended up are a mystery. However, going against this is that image of Pedro that was found. There's nothing to suggest it was taken by anyone affiliated with that criminal network. It was just shared with them, suggesting that Afonso was the one and only involved in his disappearance, which makes it even sadder since he was seen as a family friend. that brings us to the conclusion of the Insomnia Community Iceberg. I hope you guys liked the way that I covered the mysteries you chose. Goodbye, and good night.